Well, it's kind of funny because one of the questions I had written down was, and what struck me about your book is that, it's supposed to, it's a book on AI, but actually, my question to you was, isn't this does isn't AI, especially perhaps as it's currently formulated and its various algorithmic systems, a way of holding out a mirror to ourselves and those enduring questions we have, and notably perhaps the fictions that we've been relying on. I mean, I'm thinking there was a recent article in Hedgehog Review, for example, on how even the constitution of the self is a fiction, because there is no such thing as the self. You remind us in your book that there's no such thing for algorithms as truth. What is truth? What is the self? What is identity? What is morality? What is ethics? And a particular question that has been consuming me, some might say tormenting me, the nexus between reason and unreason, the spectrum between reason and unreason. And in fact, it has been tormenting me so much that I have this whole piece of paper of questions and comments just on that. So we will have to get back to it. And yes, do you think that our particular algorithmic movement is a way of holding out a mirror to us on these particular enduring questions? That, it's a good way of refracting towards ourselves?
Thank you, Audrey. So it's the mirror question. And I would have urged, of course, everyone to read Shannon Ballard's lovely book on the AI mirror. So thinking about, that and the sort of philosophies around the mirror. I think I want to say that um, we, yes, let's begin with this kind of question of, does it hold up the mirror? Does it kind of reflect us? And I think I want to say that there's this kind of sense of reflection is one way of course, imagining the relationship that we have as a society with artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms. But I guess there was an article that we wrote recently called A World Model. It was a co-written piece in what we were trying to do in that piece was to really say, well, whilst of course there's a lot of hype around the idea of the world model, the question really is, how do these machine learning technologies become world making, right? So how exactly are they kind of constituting and interpreting our world in various ways? So where I think sometimes there can be a problem with the idea of reflection of society is, we can maybe think about historical studies of previous moments of technological mirrors, right? Like the statistical mirror. So did the statistical mirror hold up a mirror to society and reflect it and its inequalities and racism and kind of eugenics projects and so on? Or does that statistical mirror, of course, shape and give kind of a particular kind of orientation to that society? So I think that, an algorithmic society for me is also actually a radical rupture in some of the ways that we think of our forms of classification and categorization. So, that this is actually not so much perhaps a direct reflection, but it's a way of thinking about how we are differently understanding the human. So an example of that could be, do zero shot models, or the claims that are made about zero shot models, do they mirror contemporary kind of politics and political life? And I think to an extent they absolutely do. So I think that the examples we're seeing recently with the Tony Blair Institute, for example, and this claim around the iterative AI state. In some ways, I was a bit horrified at this use of iteration, which I use a lot in cloud ethics to think about iteration. But actually, this kind of sense that zero-shot models are shaping actually our contemporary political moment. So in the logic that is deep in the idea of zero shot, that is to say, well, actually with zero shot, machine learning models can deal with the unencountered data and it can be applied to a new task without specific training on that task. To an extent, I think, and we've made this argument in some of our recent work, that is actually producing some of the dynamics of a zero shot politics. That is a politics that is that is, stripped out of context and actually foreclosed in terms of our capacity to kind of shape our political present, or to make an intervention, to protest something, to try to shape our futures. So in a sense, mirrors and refraction to an extent, but I think that these are concepts that we need to take seriously as constituting what we're looking at. And in a way, that's not a new claim. We can think about work Donald Mackenzie did, for example, his book, An Engine, Not a Camera, right? These financial algorithms are an engine of the financial markets and not simply a camera. So I think that's the case that I want to put, which is that what I've called a machine learning political order is not simply a mirror of our politics and our society. It is a distinctive form of ordering and a distinctive form of classification that exceeds the statistical forms that predate it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Um, you talk about, and also in your brilliant previous book, The Politics of Possibility, you talk, they are quite heavily focused on speculation and fabulation. What would you have to say about that? You've mentioned concepts, the idea that some concepts or paradigms or ways of thinking aren't novel. What would you have to say about fabulation and how it's generally perceived and portrayed, and the role
Mm,
it has actually perhaps played in our societies?
mm. Yeah, and I have had real cause to go back to that as well recently. Like, and again, this is about sharing this with the audience, like my own kind of dilemmas about this, because in Politics of Possibility, I was tracing the emergence in a particular state form, a very distinctive and specific post 9/11 state form, in which governments were actively inviting commercial suppliers of what were at the time data mining algorithms into security and into politics. And that was about, I argue in that book, coalescing the kind of commercial target, the idea of targeting a consumer for a particular product, that those IBM researchers that were working on the Bell Labs and others working on those algorithms became suppliers to the state of targeting in another way, right? So the targeting of the consumer became the targeting of the security threat. And I think we have to say those things are still happening now, and, of huge concern to all of us. I'm sure that, could this model of the iterative AI state be what they have in mind for the governing of Gaza, right? Could this be about the absolute instantiation of a particular geopolitical model with an AI logic that has emerged with? So, the fabulation and the speculation is there, and yet I think the form of prediction that I outlined in The Politics of Possibility has undergone change that we have to take seriously. So where the form of prediction there, I think, was a preemptive state, it was about how to act in the present on the basis of a possible future. That was what I meant by the politics of possibility, I suppose, the action on the basis of possibility in the absence of the strict calculation of statistical probability. And what's happening now? I mean, a complete coalescence of a logic of prediction, which is not a strict prediction of the future on the basis of tracking forwards from the past or the present, but is, I think, much more a logic of prediction drawn from contemporary artificial intelligence models, in which the task of prediction is closer to what, Ilya Sutskever and others, OpenAI, have described in their generative pre-trained models around the power of the prediction of the next token or the next word in the sentence having a power to do more than simply generate the next thing. And to me, that is actually something quite significantly different to the logics of preemption that were, I think, in my Politics of Possibility book, around speculative forms of security, and in cloud ethics around fabulation and the kind of algorithmic fabulation I describe there. So yes, a key part of this machine learning political order is a particular instantiation of prediction, one that I think powerfully, I can see Dan McQuillan making a comment in the chat on this, powerfully coalescing a particular kind of state imaginary of governance and government with the logics of artificial intelligence that we're seeing emerge in contemporary machine learning. Yeah.
Thank you. That was very thorough. Which brings us to kind of, a question. I mean, perhaps my favorite chapter and in the book, and perhaps something that's not necessarily mentioned so explicitly too often is the slight absurdity. You mean you talk about madness, the absurdity of this situation, because we have these systems that are trying fundamentally to calculate and to know the uncalculable, the calculable. And as someone who's very interested and fascinated with the
Mm.
question of the nexus, the relationship between reason and unreason, I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, on the kind of rationality at play, the nexus
Mm.
precisely. What was your take on, where is that quote unquote unreason, and what is its rapport to quote unquote reason? This is
Mm.
also a very, very old debate, but that can perhaps be analyzed through the lens of modern
Mm.
AI and algorithmic
Yeah.
systems.
Thank you, Audrey. I think that's such a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge for me, and I think for all of us. And you actually really captured it in your initial framing of the question of kind of knowing the incalculable or knowing the unknowable. Because, I have had moments where I've gone back to the kind of conclusion of cloud ethics where I think about the unattributable as perhaps a space that remains open, like to be prized open. Like, what's the space for critique? Where is the space for resistance? Is it, where is it? And is it in this kind of the gap that exists in this kind of sense that it's possible to somehow calculate the incalculable, know the unknowable. And in the conclusion of cloud ethics, I talk about the unattributable. And I do think that has been a major challenge. And there have been moments in trying to take, I think you're right with the absurdity, but maybe my inclination is also to take it seriously as well, and so these moments of absurdity to kind of also see, to take seriously the claim because of the performative power of the claim. And there are moments where I think that actually is there any unattributable element left in the context of generative AI, right? So in a very recent article that was published only a week or two ago with my colleagues, the politics of the prompt, we're trying to work through, well, then what kind of relation is the prompt and prompting an AI model? How does that change the relation of the kind of user of artificial intelligence and machine learning, generative pre-trained models with, how does it change our relation to the model? And in this case, and the case that we trace in the paper is around the use of prompting in government and what that does to democracy. I could see in the chat people were talking about democracy and the kind of challenges of experienced in terms of democracy and democratic transformation. But really, in this case, the prompt is continually and perennially reformulated, and it's always possible to change the prompt, to shift it, to tweak it, to become a better prompt engineer. And so, I guess it's an open question, but is that space of the unattributable itself now being closed out by a form of machine learning that we're now looking at, in which we can just continually shift it if we don't like the output. So where I emphasized in cloud ethics the kind of foreclosures around a single output, right, that there was a multiplicity contained within the model in which we ought to be able to relocate some of those possibilities and potentials. What's happening now when we have a continual capacity to reformulate that single output? It's no longer singular, right? We can always change it, and we can always change that relation. So yes, I think it's a question, what is the scope left for thinking about the incalculable, that which cannot be known and calculated, the unattributable, and does that mean that we're not just talking about probability and possibility, but potentiality? So is it that these models actually act upon a space that we might think of as being a space of potentiality, that which is emergent, which we might, most of us with a kind of critical lens would say that that's often a space for critique, right? It's the space where we can think about critical thinking and a different kind of response. So yes.
Jean Baudrillard would tell you that all of the potentialities have been exhausted by now. But I mean, and this leads me, and thank you for that. And this leads me to perhaps my slight questioning about your book. I mean, in a world where we can continuously update and reformulate the output, that
Mhm.
things are shifting all the time. You mentioned groundlessness, and combined with political urgency, for quick, rapid, efficient decision making. How does that actually work? If I
Tell me what you mean by quick, rapid decision making.
Well, in a way, in a world where we need politics, that perhaps people will counter and say, "But we don't have time to prise open this and to read to examine the various to go back to the various forks and re-examine the various possibilities and the bends that could have
Mm.
been taken." What would you say to these people?
Mm. Yeah, so then the moment of decision is being kind of perennially deferred. And I think that, that the advent of the prompt absolutely does this. We discuss in this paper, and I really mean it very seriously, that even the already limited capacity for us to think about, I don't know, some kind of agonistic politics or some kind of more critical democratic form, that we still need to be able to locate the possibility for a decision that could have been otherwise. And this formulation, the one that we track in the paper on the prompt, is one in which the moment of decision is just perennially deferred. Yes. So then the question is, I guess, how to speak back to that. What does it mean to organize? What does it mean to have a kind of a protest politics or a politics of resistance in the context of this? And, what would I say about that? I would say it's that this form of power itself is not really very well understood yet. Honestly, I don't think that people are really taking seriously and tracking what exactly is this form of power, right? And I think we do have to understand that because, I do still say that all moments of resistance take place within the context of that power relation, and it's still now not well understood. I still find it not adequate to say that the situation that we're looking at is one in which this is just AI hype or the bubble will burst, because the absolute stripping out and austerity that is kind of in parallel with that, in which the any sense that we might be able to say that there is a social model worth holding on to is simultaneously being stripped out. So this is not just about the introduction of machine learning tools into the most critical aspects of our lives, from warfare and welfare to immigration decisions to all of that. It's actually about how we imagine our relationship to ourselves and others. It is about our capacity to think about having a form of politics that can say, here we have this thing in common. So I do mean that seriously, and I do mean it practically, that the form of power is urgent, to really map this form of power, to understand how it takes place and to understand how it takes root is, to me, that is crucial. Like, that's not just a kind of nice thing to do in terms of thinking. It's action as well. It's not just thought, it's action too. Yeah.
Yes, and one of my questions was, especially towards the end of the book, you talk about fabulation and present that model. And I was going to ask for a concrete illustration, but we can move on. You're not fair. You're not fair. Yes, could you tell us a bit about? So you have this new wonderful center, and it's been a few years since you have written these two wonderful, very erudite, very wonderful books. So, where has your research taken you since then, and where is it taking you now, if we are projecting ourselves
Mhm.
into the unknowable?
Yeah, well, you asked for a concrete example. I think that the work that we've done over the past 5 years in the Algorithmic Societies project has been first and foremost concrete. Like, I think I would say that what we've done is stayed absolutely with the concrete. Um, and so, for example, in thinking about and taking seriously the kinds of concepts that we've interrogated, so generativity, that is to think about generativity beyond the idea of generating an output, and to think about generativity instead as, concretely in terms of a machine learning idea as about estimating underlying distributions in data, but then thinking concretely, if the idea of generativity is a logic that has a much more durable political formation, then in what ways does this kind of estimation of underlying distributions in data change how we are then governed, right? How does it change how we're governed in terms of our health, or in terms of our welfare, or in terms of the battlefield and kind of military examples? All of our papers contain concrete examples of how this generative logic is instantiated in the world. Taking seriously a concept like latency, I find it really curious in a way that so much of of course, the latent space is absolutely crucial to this particular period of artificial intelligence. But we've all been thinking about, what is something latent? It's something that is hidden but present. It's something that emerges. But, taking seriously what concretely comes from this latency. And I guess this is another reason why maybe it's not directly a mirror. The latent space compresses data. It has to compress data in order to function. So, what happens in that compression? What does it mean, again, if we're being governed as a society, we are relating to ourselves and to others in a logic that is also geared towards the compression of data in order to detect the thing that is latent? And in the opening pages of Cloud Ethics, I'm, talking about an old style system towards the end of, I guess, 2016, 2017, which was about in a way, the latent tendencies of a protest movement, and how some quite old-fashioned rules-based algorithms were being used to detect those changes. But still, this question of latency, I think, is a kind of concrete and situated example of what we're trying to do. Take the concept, trace it into an actual instantiation, and where it can materially be found in our algorithmic society, right? It's not just the model, it's how we are and how we are ordered and organized. So the work that we've been doing since has been tracing a kind of genealogy of some of these ideas, historically situating them, so that in a way, this is kind of to speak against the grain of the idea of AI hype, and to say, no, has historical context, it's situated. We need to understand why it takes place at a certain time. It's a genealogical kind of method. And I guess, yeah, so that's where we're at. I wrote an essay called Machine Learning Political Orders, and I suppose that's what the next book is. The next book is kind of, what is the shape of our contemporary machine learning political order? What does it mean for us? How do we think differently about politics in this context? Yeah. So that's I guess where we've been the last 5 years or so, and the centre, with great thanks to the Leverhulme Trust for funding us for 10 years to extend this across disciplines, so that we can meaningfully have people from across literature, modern languages, philosophy, computer science, mathematics, talking about these concepts and taking the differences and the um, taking those kind of different vocabularies not as the limiting point for our conversation and our politics and our ethics, but as precisely the spur to those conversations. So, so that's the vision for the centre and what we're hoping to build when we start to advertise our fellowship positions next month is that it will be open to every discipline, and that what will bring us together is the work around concepts and the work around differences in the vocabularies that we use to engage those concepts.
Thank you very much for this very thorough response. And obviously, I didn't mean it as my question about concreteness was not meant as an attack, but as something that can be countered and saying basically you're just a bunch of philosophers, with your air castles, as they used to say. So yes, yes,
Yeah, I mean, it's real though, right? I mean, that's right, isn't it? I mean, that
that's
we
generally the
absolutely,
criticism
yeah,
countered
absolutely.
against people who are in the humanities or more the social sciences, and these seem to play quite be at the forefront
Hmm.
of your book. You talk a lot about Foucault, genealogy,
Yeah.
who is the perhaps best associated with that, genealogical impulse. You talk about, you mentioned Derrida a lot, Deleuze,
Mm.
and
Judith Butler. I mean, I think in terms
yes,
of the ethics, I think Judith Butler has been the most influential thinker in terms of like how this has taken shape, And maybe we can say now with kind of the language question, returning to some of that, very, old work of the 1990s that I grew up with as a grad student, which is to think about speech and to think about politics and speech. What happens to the language in large language model when we're thinking about speech that is a kind of co-production of speech with machines? These are all, important questions. But I completely agree, of course. The kind of sense that the place for social science and humanities in relation to our contemporary AI debates is somehow in, framing the ethical response to it, or, or asking questions of its place in our society. I mean, as if we are outside it, right? This kind of continual positioning of us outside it. And I think that part of the reclaiming of the concepts is about the idea that this is already a question of philosophy and a question of thought all the way down, right? From the beginning.
and reclaiming and putting forward different premises and different
Mhm.
um, um, ways of approaching things, which is something
Mhm.
you do very, very well and very eloquently by also powerfully making the case for the humanities and the need for them. Why don't we open the floor to questions? We have two from Dan McQuillan, who has told us that these are distorting mirrors in which serial killers wander. It's not completely inaccurate. And he asks us two questions. Is an unintended side effect of generalizable models the creation of intersectional harms and therefore a potential for solidarities? And another one on are data centers the Achilles heel of contemporary AI?
Are they in the chat so I
They
can
are
just
in the
see?
chat, yeah, if you want to read
Yeah.
them.
Where are we? Generalizable. Oh, there's too much in there. Okay, let's
We
just
can
think
see how
about,
much
yeah.
time.
I mean, I think the question of generalizability and the kind of the claim to the general model, that's what, I think we were trying to do with the world model paper. And it is a real balancing act, isn't it? Because not to overclaim and kind of give this sense that there is, if you like, a world model, but nonetheless to draw attention to the kind of performativity and the power of the claim of a capacity to have something that is generalizable to a new task without specific training. I guess that's what I meant by the kind of zero shot politics. That's what I mean by the zero shot politics, right? It's the claim to task agnosticism, completely acknowledging the important work that has been done in showing us why actually they are not task agnostic, right? But yes, I think that some of the harms that are done, and I think that you said Dan described those as kind of intersectional harms and as, if you like, making it more difficult somehow for us then to form solidarities. I think that's right. I think that this kind of notion of a world model in which the power is in the idea that you can apply always to a new case without without training. I'm saying that there's a kind of a resonance in thought. I'm not even sure resonance is like the right word. I'm not sure resonance is exactly right, but that this is paralleled and powerfully kind of coalesces with the idea that one doesn't need to think about situated experience, that one does not need to think about the embodied relation that we have to an algorithmic world, and exactly how we might then forge alliances with others in terms of their relation to that kind of algorithmic model. So yes, I think that the claim to task agnosticism and the claim to zero shot does, to an extent, undercut the capacity that we might have to forge those kind of collaborations and solidarities, and potentially stands in the way of kind of a more fundamental kind of resistance movement. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions?
Um,
Fill the zone with zero shot.
so we just have the two questions from Dan. So I'd invite people tuned in to please do send your questions using the Q&A box. In the meantime, I have a question which I'd like to pose. So I was really interested by this idea of zero shot politics, and it was making me think about whether there is something to be gained from thinking about what AI is doing to politics and doing to thought more generally in terms of a kind of industrialization or an industrial logic. So this idea that in the same way that industrial production kind of cheapens the relative value of the material goods that we make, something similar might be going on with AI. It's kind of cheapening the relative cost and the relative value of thought, of deliberation, of discussion, of working through difficult questions. So this kind of cognitive labor becomes automated and cheapened. And I wonder if we kind of translate that into the political realm, it's creating a scenario in which increasingly to ask for something to be thought through properly is a kind of luxury demand. As particularly in areas of government that are short of funding, and they're trying to implement AI models as a way of kind of being able to run more cheaply. The idea that people might get together and say, no, we want to have a discussion about this, we want to deliberate about this, becomes a kind of a luxury demand.
A privilege.
It's a really good question, Andres. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I guess one of the problems, and I find this myself, is kind of what the thing is that I'm nostalgic for. So I knew I was kind of really unsettled by the use of the so-called AI red box in the UK government, which is the case study that we trace through in the Politics of the Prompt paper. But the idea of, I kept coming back to this question of what does it mean to turn a public consultation, to put a public consultation through a large language model. Like, so when you want the large language model to summarize the public consultation, because, we might say, well, actually, the public consultation is already a pretty denuded example of this difficult question, like the difficult question which could be around a really kind of intractable political problem, and it's a sort of very already a kind of very diminished and minimal way of kind of engaging, but it's nonetheless about engaging the difficulty and impossibility of decision in a way, or at least acknowledging the intractability of politics in various forms. So once you have this kind of use of AI red box models in government, the claim that that's just summarizing the response to the questions in a public consultation, or even that it's just summarizing all of the past parliamentary questions on a particular debate. And it's in the public domain already that it's also being used as a parliamentary handling strategy. I'm pretty sure that's the language that they're using, because they're able to track, well, what were the discussions the last time this question was raised, and can we preempt or predict what the response might be so that we can smooth the path of this bill through Parliament. So even in the kind of already limited kind of political space that we're thinking about here in terms of parliamentary democracy, I think the introduction of the so-called AI red box is precisely being claimed to reduce the difficulty that is what would actually look like the posing of a question, right? So we often describe it colloquially as you ask a question of ChatGPT, or you pose a question. But actually, is it a question in the sense that a philosopher or a social theorist and political thinker would say a question is? That is a question in which we are not already anticipating the response, or a question where we are uncertain even of our own motivations or intentions, right? So I absolutely think that the foreclosures that I identified in cloud ethics are proliferating through this sense that political difficulty can be smoothed out, and we can already know what the response or the answer would be before we pose the question. So cheapening thought and deliberation, and to an extent, I think cheapening expertise. And I guess people working on these sorts of large language models in different areas. So the people, looking at AI in health, for example, what does it mean for clinical expertise to have this different form of question answer, or this different form of relation in which they're prompting a model? And it's happening everywhere, isn't it? So the idea that in legal practice, for example, that now prompts the model to say, what's the case law in this area? And I think this brings me back to the kind of question of compression and latency, that actually understanding the logic of the model really matters for thinking about, well, what actually happens then for our ways of thinking about this, and we've absolutely, when we were talking to the civil servants around the use of this generative AI model, they were saying, well, does it not matter anymore that we've spent 20 years in the Foreign Office, and that we've worked on these questions and we know how difficult they are, and now here is the AI red box that's able to solve the problem. So yeah, I think that's right. I think that this idea of a kind of a form of thought in which we are encountering difficulty that might not be resolvable, right? That's crucial also to political life. It's crucial for organizing. It's crucial for even imagining an alternative possible way of organizing requires those things. And, the conclusion that we drew when we examined this kind of broadening of the idea of prompting an AI model in government, so that even the public's interaction with government services, for example, welfare and tax and so on, would also happen through the formulation of the prompt, is that ultimately what would be happening is everyone's prompting the same model, which, given what I'm saying about taking seriously the logic, means the worldview, the worldview that's embedded in the model becomes this kind of space devoid of contestation, and devoid of what you've described as deliberative thought, but actually we might also think of in terms of critique, right? The critique that is about saying, I do not yet know in advance what that might look like. And I think that's a danger of this machine learning political order, that effectively it's not even anymore about kind of a problematization that governs a particular solution, but it begins with this kind of generated solution and works back from there. So yeah, so I guess for me then that's about tracing what some of those foreclosures are, and thinking differently about how to map out what this kind of form of power is and what the political project looks like as a result. Yeah.
Very interesting you say that, because even the envisaging of that kind of
Yeah.
solution is actually not new at all. It can actually be very easily traced back to Leibniz, who thought, let's invent this perfect universal language whereby we'll all think the same perfectly rationally, and we won't, in fact, nearly need to think at all. Thought will be perfectly mechanized. We will, and we'll only have to calculate, and we will never be troubled by disputes or politics ever again. So
Yeah.
fantasies.
Somebody, Salman Khan, just commented in the chat, already at play in migration governance regimes, and I think that's exactly right. And that was absolutely my starting point in the work on the deep border. That actually, this is a kind of space of experimentation. That some of the first hackathons that took place in the use of these kinds of AI models happened in the context of migration governance and immigration and asylum claims. So that's absolutely right, that this is already a world model that's at work in migration governance. I think that's a really important point.
We had another question by Dan. Are data centers the Achilles heel of contemporary AI?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what Dan means by the Achilles heel. I mean, if he means like the limit point, I think it's so important that we trace what these limit points are. So that, as a geographer, that's really important. What are the material limit points of this world model, of this world, if this kind of like regime, algorithmic regime, what are its limit points? And could they be data centers? I guess we've seen with AWS today, powered by AWS. So we could say Achilles heel, or we could say that the chips, that the kind of geopolitics around the chips become the Achilles heel. But I guess I'm really nervous about limit points. The bubble will burst, there will be an Achilles heel, there will be a limit point, because I suppose the focus of a lot of my work has been on what are these technologies as limit devices, right? Which so far, in the 20 years of work that I've done since my kind of original biometric borders paper in 2005, right? That's 20 years ago, biometric borders work. What's happened to those limit points that I felt like I'd identified along the way? Like there's a limit here, there'll be space for a response here because of the limit. What's happened is that the limit points have been kind of colonized, right? The limit points have been kind of become, I think Dan put somewhere in the chat about the business model, but it's also a state model, right? It's an extremely fungible, very malleable model also of sovereignty, I think. So yes, it's about AI and tech and business models, but it's also like a longer story of kind of sovereign power and how sovereignty is at work in this, and how those kind of sovereign forms are constantly able to exceed the limit. So I,
That's very
it's going to be a thing, isn't it? Data centers and cloud, and whether this is a limit point, and if the bubble does burst, whether people say, okay, that's the end. And I think I started the conversation that we had here by saying that part of the job is to think about what's durable in the logic. So even if we have a huge kind of financial crisis on the basis of the AI over inflation, an AI bubble, I'm going to say that the political model that accompanied it will be durable and will persist. So the kind of the AI logic that accompanied austerity will persist beyond the particular material instantiation of a kind of cloud governance and a cloud network and infrastructure. Yeah.
And since we've touched on politics, perhaps a final question from Salman Khan, who writes a very pertinent question. In relation to our current machine learning political order, what are your thoughts on how and in what ways this may dovetail with, cement, even rearticulate the current rise of far-right ideas and policies? I'm thinking in particular of what's happening in the US, but also what's been proposed separately by Labour and Reform in the UK, and the role that AI will have to play.
It's absolutely the question. I think it's the most important question. There have been some really wonderful books and papers recently around kind of techno-populism, or like just trying to work through like what exactly is the relationship between the rise of the far right and fascism and these kind of AI technologies. And absolutely, I think that is our task. And I suppose my call, if it is a call, is for us to say, well, this is always more than just the deployment of these tools by these kinds of groups, because that's not new, right? We could trace that through the 1930s and 1940s, I tried to do that a bit in Politics of Possibility, like think through like actually what were the conditions of possibility in a statistical society in relation to in relation to the rise of 20th century fascism to an extent. Like how do we think about, and that's why I said that resonance is not enough, right? Because this is about like, are there alliances? And of course, we know there are alliances between individuals. So it is possible to point to the people who are involved in this kind of envisioning of the world. But I do think that it is, it's not quite as straightforward as that, right? So that the Tony Blair Institute claims around the iterative AI state, like I'm serious about the links between that and and Gaza and this kind of like spatial imagination of a state founded upon a particular kind of AI imagining of the world. I think that we need to take that very seriously, and I think that the use of particular AI technologies in the battlefield in Ukraine, but also in Gaza, they're not just kind of spheres of kind of experimentation that I wrote about in the Deep Border paper. They are actually also about, a different kind of thinking, if you like, that is potentially going to give shape to the dissolution of the left, right? And actually the left is in it, right? The left's quite complicit in this rise of the iterative AI state. So yes, I absolutely think that the logics that we are working on and that we're trying to kind of take seriously as shaping the world are simultaneously moving back and forth in a geopolitical sense and in the sense of kind of fueling the far right racism, xenophobia. It's absolutely there, and it's already present, as Salman pointed out, in migration governance.
Great. Well, I think that's all the time that we have for this event, so we're going to have to wrap up. But I'd like to say a huge thank you to Louise and Audrey for this discussion, and thank you to everyone for tuning in as well. We'll be continuing the AI and digital series in 2 weeks, when Dan McQuillan will be in conversation about resisting AI. So we hope to see you then.
That'll be good fun. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Andres. And see you in 2 weeks' time.
Thanks, everyone.